Well, this is the 50th episode, and this is the Technics SL-D2. It's a direct drive turntable from the late 70s, and aside from me having a deep personal connection to this model, it's also just an all-around nice turntable for its price point with some interesting siblings. What does that mean? Well, let's dive in. So this is the Technics SL-D2 direct drive automatic turntable system. It was released in 1979 and is very much like Mary Kate Olsen. It has both an identical twin and a younger, more powerful sister. See, this is one of two identical looking machines that were released by Technics. One is the SL-D1, a fully manual version, and this, the SL-D2, which is identical, but it has auto return. Except not exactly, and that's what I found interesting about the pair. There was also the SL-D3, but it looks a little bit different and went on to star as Scarlet Witch in the MCU, so we're not going to talk about that one. At a quick glance, you could be forgiven for thinking that these are identical. After all, the bodies are the same, the tone arm is the same, even the platter is identical. But if you look closer, you'll notice that on the D1 model, this button is labeled on/off, but on mine, it's labeled stop. What's that about? Before I answer that, let me give you a brief backstory. When I was a kid, my dad had an SL-D1 that he bought at a blowout sale in 1980 for just over $80, and which was an omnipresent fixture of every house that I've lived in throughout my childhood. Once I got into record collecting, he gave me that turntable, and it sort of acted as a catalyst for my love of vintage stereo equipment. Unfortunately, in what was a very tragic case of irresponsible U-Haul truck use, that turntable took a fall into the fires of Mount Doom while I was moving about 8 years ago. That's why I was so excited to get this one. So what's going on with those buttons? Well, Matsushita, the company behind Panasonic, the company behind Technics, is nothing if not efficient. They made the decision to use the same plinth case for both the D1 and D2 models, which was financially prudent, but left them with a conundrum. If there's no auto return, what do we do with the hole for the stop button? Car companies often cover those holes with little panels, but Panasonic did something a little more clever. They kept the button and made it into a power switch, something this machine doesn't have. Well, not a visible one anyway. I'll show you what they did in a minute, but for now let's talk about the visible stuff. I think the thing that stands out most on first glance, at least it did to me as a kid, is the big prism sticking up next to the platter. So let's start there. When you play a record, it goes without saying you want to hear it playing back at the right speed. Unless you're an overzealous Alvin and the Chipmunks fan, in which case, you do you. But they've included two speed controls. You have a speed selector and a pitch adjustment. The speed selector is a 3-position switch which lets you choose between 33 and 45 RPM, and the center position is stop. The prism has a flickering LED light that acts as a timing strobe. With your speed selected, you can finely tune it by 5% by referencing this little table for the speed that you want and making the dots or lines sync up with the strobe so that they appear to stand still. That lets you know that the speed is right. As a resident of North America, we're looking at the bottom two indicators because our wall power is 60 Hz. You guys in Europe, Asia, and Australia with 50 Hz mains power will reference the top indicators, all of which are machined into the die-cast aluminum platter. Opposite the speed control is the stop button. To take a look at that, let's play a record. How about the obvious choice? With the disc in place, we want to unclip the tone arm, flip this lever to raise it up, then move the stylus into position over the record. When you do that, it triggers a small internal switch that turns the machine on. That's basically the power button. Assuming there's no dust on your disc, we can lower the cueing lever to drop the tone arm and the record will begin to play. If you want to stop the record, you just hit the stop button and the tone arm will automatically lift up and return to its rest pillar. If you don't press stop, it'll just automatically return to its post when it hits the runout groove on the record. That's simple enough, but if you remember, the power switch is triggered partway into the travel of the tone arm. So why doesn't it just turn off as soon as the tone arm comes back? It's important to note that the motion of the tone arm isn't driven by a separate electrical system, but rather the spinning of the platter itself. Because of that, they used a little bit of clockwork trickery to delay the switch turning off by a couple of rotations so that the arm has adequate time to get back to its rest position and lower the little anvil before powering off. That's not something unique to this turntable or even unique to Panasonic products, but because I've seen turntables that don't have that feature, I feel like it's worth pointing out. Up on the base of the tone arm, you've got two main adjustments, your tracking force and your anti-skate. To refresh, tracking force is how much downward pressure the stylus places on the record, and anti-skate is basically the resistance of the tone arm wanting to jump inward. The tracking force is set with a counterweight just like the ones at the doctor's office. The anti-skate in this case uses a spring and generally should be about the same as the tracking force. As a side note, when you buy a new turntable, you have to set the tracking force and the anti-skate, but it's also important to set that stuff on a used turntable as well. I have a video all about that if you're not sure how to set those things, so we're not going to go into all that stuff here, except to say that tracking force is determined by the cartridge. So if you want to know what the right settings are, look up the cartridge, not the turntable. Speaking of cartridges, let's take a look at that stuff. For the uninitiated, this piece here is the head shell, this is the cartridge, and this little needle is called the stylus. You can swap out the cartridge if the stylus wears out or if you want to upgrade, and a lot of people do that. This turntable originally shipped with an EPC 270C, which is a moving magnet cartridge. We've covered that before, but to refresh, that means that the stylus has a little magnet on the end and it moves within a fixed coil of wire to generate the audio signal. This cartridge has been changed to an Audio-Technica TC2000. I'm not sure how long ago that happened or why, and I haven't really had time to sit and listen to it much, so I can't tell you whether or not I like it compared to my previous turntable that had an Ortofon red cartridge. I'll have to get back to you guys on that one. The head shell comes off by turning this nut, which releases the whole thing. You can see the 4 wires for the left and right stereo channels, which pop on and off with these delicate little connectors and posts. The 2 little slotted bolts attach the cartridge to the head shell and can move in these slots to allow for alignment adjustments. It also has this tiny little branded cover that folds down to protect the stylus. I love that. Moving to the back, it comes with a 45 adapter that lives on this little peg and pops down into the center of the platter so you can play 45s. It also has a little slotted hole in the back left corner. That's there to store either your head shell or additional head shells so that they can be swapped out quickly. Some folks have different cartridges for different styles of music, different vinyl types, or what my dad used to do is keep a crappy old stylus on hand for playing records that were old, dirty, and beat up so that it wouldn't mess up his good stylus. The dust cover is held up with springs, but can also be removed if you prefer. It just slides out. It also has 2 tiny little rubber feet in the corners so that it sets down just a little more gently and it doesn't rattle. We also can't forget the little emblem on the top. The entire unit sits up on 4 feet, which have fairly hefty springs that act as shock absorbers. These have a pyramid motif all around the circumference, and if we look closely, that same motif is carried through the entire design with tiny rows of pyramids on the pitch dial, the anti-skate dial, the counterweight, and the head shell nut. I also appreciate this little angled bit on the speed control cutout. The surface of the platter has a thick, heavy rubber mat on it. While I prefer these myself, I would advise caution because old ones like this have a tendency to start to deteriorate over time by leaching out the oily plasticizer and getting stiff and brittle in the process. Once they're like that, it's best not to put your good records on them and just replace them with something else like cork or whatever you prefer. The worst part is once your rubber mat deteriorates, you can't really replace it with an original because oftentimes all the other ones that were made at the same time end up doing the exact same thing. If we look at the back, we can see the power cord and the signal cables. If I have to complain about something, it would definitely be the hardwired cables. I don't like when components have those for no other reason than you're limited to how long they can be, and if the ends get messed up for whatever reason, it's a much bigger headache to replace them. I know that's not a problem when you're buying high-end new equipment, but we're dealing with secondhand thrift store stuff. Sometimes cables get dragged across concrete floors or stepped on. It happens. The audio cords are about 3.5 feet long or just over a meter. There's also the ever-critical grounding wire to eliminate the 60-cycle hum. And of course, it still has the original label on the back. I'd like to flip it over, but before I do, I need to remove the rubber mat, lift the platter off, and remove the 45 adapter. You can actually see the motor itself. It interacts with a magnetic ring on the platter, which makes it spin and looks a little bit like an arc reactor. Let's also make sure that the tone arm is locked in place. Now we can flip it over. To get it open, you have to unscrew all 4 of the feet and these 3 screws. The feet are cool little bits of engineering on their own. Felt bottom, coil spring, and flexible rubber attachment point. Anyway, once those are all out, the bottom panel lifts off. It's a very thick, very heavy polymer material. Listen to the sound that makes. I've never seen a thick panel like this. That's cool. There's all the internal workings. Something fun I noticed, this main gear has a section in the middle that isn't used by anything in this machine, which means this exact same part is used on a different turntable. If anyone knows which models that internal program is used for, let me know. You can also see the power switch I mentioned earlier under this metal plate. And that little dial is what adjusts the spring tension for the anti-skate. Neat. So that is the Technics SL-D2 automatic turntable from 1979, which is now my permanent listening rig. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope to see you again in the next one. In the meantime, get out there, hit those thrift stores, hit those estate sales, and as always, stay metal.